Hi, everybody. Welcome to Evolve, where we focus on the evolution of leadership. And I'm Kim Ford, your host, and I have a very special guest today. Do you mind please introducing yourself and your company?
Yeah, absolutely, Kim. Thanks for having me on. My name is Jay Goldman. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Sensei Labs. We make an enterprise orchestration platform called Conductor, which is in use by large enterprise and professional service firms around the world to help orchestrate their most critical initiatives, often in the space of transformations, post-merger integrations, procurement and supply chain optimizations, ESG programs, that kind of thing.
Okay, I'm exhausted now. Like that's a lot. I can't wait to dive a little bit deeper to find out kind of how that relates, because our clients and our relationships are mostly CEOs, CFOs, COOs. So the C-suite, they love to hear about what, of course, everybody's going through some type of transformation anymore.
Absolutely.
What steps, and I think about leadership and I think of what's been going on, what steps can leaders take right now to prepare for what's really become a more hybrid work environment? It wasn't necessarily anything, before the pandemic, it existed a little bit. I mean, I know people that have worked remote for years, but very few and far between.
Yeah, I think remote was a sort of weird thing that some companies did and no one else really got it. It kind of felt a bit like a cult almost, like
exactly.
People who preached about remote, but everybody else wasn't really paying attention. And the way that we look at it, the last 2 years collectively around the world has really compressed about a decade of digital disruption into that 2-year period. And so today, where we might be on a Teams call or on a Zoom call, it was unheard of that we would have done those same things that way 2 years ago. I spent a good portion of my life flying around the world to meetings with customers and partners because there was an expectation you would show up in person for those. And that expectation has largely gone away, which I think is great. It's great for the planet, obviously. It's great for my travel schedule, and I'm sure many of your listeners as well. But we've realized that actually this is a pretty good way of doing a lot of those conversations. And it doesn't replace being in person, obviously, but for a lot of the things that we do, this is a perfectly acceptable way to do it. And the fact that over the course of my day so far, I've had meetings with people all over North America from my home office, that means that I'm so much more able to do those things just in a higher bandwidth kind of capacity. Hybrid is an interesting question. I don't think we collectively know the answer, and I think we are reacting in real time to something that is difficult to parse out our reaction to the current moment versus where we'll want to be in, say, a year from now. And so when we started this pandemic journey, unfortunately, collectively, we all wanted to just get back to the normal that we had before. And so everybody went into this thinking, well, it'll be a couple of weeks or maybe a few months at most, and then this will be over and I can go back to work. And so if you had asked people in that moment, what would you like from a future workplace? They would have said, I want to go back to the office. And then very quickly, actually, we all kind of settled into this and started to realize, wait, maybe this is actually better. And I really enjoy working from home. And now that I've got an office environment set up and I've got my workspace, and maybe if I've got kids, I've managed to figure out how to keep them occupied while I need to work and all that kind of stuff. Maybe there's actually a lot of advantages to this. And so then if you ask people that question in the midst of this, they said, I never want to go back to the office again. And now as the world is starting to open back up and the pendulum's swinging a little bit, when you start asking people, they have a bit of a different answer now, which is I really like working from home, but I also kind of really miss people. And so I'd like to have some mix of those two things. And what we're seeing play out in the headlines right now, when we look at the large companies, especially the large tech companies who have the headlines around the policies that they're publishing. So you look at, in the last couple of weeks, we had a headline from Apple and we had a headline from Airbnb. And those two were very, very different approaches. Airbnb said, you can work from anywhere in the world that you want. And Apple said, we expect you back in the office 3 days a week. And then we had a letter from the Apple team who responded strongly that they don't like that answer. So you had a letter come back from signed by a whole bunch of Apple employees saying, no, this is a terrible approach. I think we're seeing that pendulum swinging back and forth in real time. And the answer is difficult to know because we can only really answer from where we are today, not from where we'll be in a year from now or 2 years from now. So I would say in your question about how can leaders prepare for this is the same answer that we would give about transformations as a broad topic, which is I think strongly, we see this in the data, and we've had the opportunity to work with large enterprise around the world on their transformation projects. The successful ones have moved away from the idea that transformation is a project. And so we used to see a lot of language like we're launching a transformation project, and we have defined a timeline that will take us 3 years to execute, and we will realize this amount of benefit at the end. Mm-hmm. 2, transformation is a mindset, and evolution is the important part of that. We are entering a constant state of transformation as a strategic advantage that will help us be more successful. And in doing so, we'll continue to be reactive to all of the crazy, unprecedented, and I'm starting to hate that word, but unprecedented changing market conditions that are just happening around us, right? Supply chain shortages and inflation and stock market volatility, all of that stuff combined together. You can't anymore chart a course that says this is our transformation project and it will end in a few years. What you can do is say, how do we prepare ourselves to be agile and nimble and responsive and able to continuously transform? Hybrid is an element of that that's the same. If you set a policy today and say, this is our new work from home, work from the office, hybrid, remote, whatever you want to call it, policy, and it will be forevermore this way, you're going to be wrong. Yeah. So you have to adopt that same attitude of transformation. Right now, this is our approach.
Yeah.
But it may change.
Right. And I like the fact that you're mentioning, I think the timeline concept has changed drastically, right? I mean, I love everybody always had to have like, well, how long is this going to take? What's the deadline? How do we work on this? And quite frankly, so many factors have impacted timelines that it's really hard to give an accurate one anymore because there's many things outside of our control that were never outside of our control before.
Absolutely. Yeah. Think about all of the companies that sat down in the beginning of January 2020, said, all right, 2020 is going to be our year. This is going to be an amazing year for us. Let's sit down and do our annual planning cycle now for the year ahead. And then they prepared all those plans. And just in early March, they were like, all right, let's share the plan with everybody. We've developed the whole thing. And then 2 weeks later, the world was in chaos.
Exactly. So you mentioned something called enterprise orchestration. What does that mean?
Enterprise orchestration to us is the state that you can get to. Okay. It's that evolution towards a predictive level in the organization. When you think about a large scale program, so I'll use a transformation as an example. And even though we say you want to get away from the idea of transformation as a project, you're still going to run a transformation program, and it is going to have certain milestones and objectives and benefits that you want to track and all that kind of thing. So if you think about this as a maturity model, where the beginning of that model, or what we call level 1, is really reactive. You are reacting to changes around you. Tends to be highly siloed teams, very low level of tech enablement in those teams. They might have some team specific tools, but you really aren't shared tools across the organization. The teams don't really talk to each other, so very siloed environment. If there's any established KPI tracking, it's really all Excel spreadsheets, and the team has visibility, but nobody else does. And that really is the state that most organizations exist in when we start to work with them. That is really kind of status quo today. It will feel very familiar to many of your listeners. And then as you start to move up that maturity curve, you go from being reactive to being able to be a predictive at the sort of high end of that curve. So what we call level 4, which is full enterprise orchestration, is that you have got to a place where you are now fully predictive about what's happening in the organization. You have the ability to work entirely across teams and across silos. Everyone in the organization has real-time access to those KPIs, obviously permission managed and appropriate to their level and all of that kind of stuff. Everyone has the ability to orchestrate projects across that whole life cycle. You can do resource planning and capacity planning. You've digitized your workflows, so you're away from highly manual process into highly automatic. The PMO or the transformation management office or whoever they are is seen as strategic, not just a control function. You have a high degree of what we think of as adaptive governance. So you, at the low level, at the reactive level, you have very little corporate governance in place. At the enterprise orchestration or the predictive level, you have a high degree of governance ensuring that you are doing things the right way with the right accountability, but it's an adaptive governance model that's able to change in real time as the needs of the organization change.
That makes sense. We have many customers and clients that about 3 years ago said they would never hire outside of greater Pittsburgh. And unfortunately, within the last, I'd say 2 years, those same clients have come back and not only had to hire outside of Pittsburgh, but some of them have had to hire outside of the country. And where they're struggling now is how to build a scalable culture when everybody's not in one place. They loved, I mean, they would have never, ever imagined not having all of their designers and engineers all sitting right next to each other, collaborating every day. And they're finding that they can't get them, number one. And number two, they're having to hire the best they can from wherever they can get them from. So like, how do you build a scalable culture when you're not, I don't know, I think for me, culture's simple when you're together, right? You have kind of the expectation in the office, the looks of the office, the feels, what you build. But I think it's a lot harder to build it when everybody's not together.
So I think that the culture and the physical environment piece is often in many organizations, it's unplanned in a way. So think of it this way. You have an office and it has a particular look. But did someone sit down and say, what does this communicate about our culture and how does it enable our team to be more successful? Probably not. The office evolved. Maybe there was a designer involved and it looks great. Some of those offices look great, but are really actually quite unpractical from a getting work done perspective. And there's the seating area that no one ever sits in because the furniture is actually not very comfortable and
but
it's very loud when you sit there.
Really
but man, does it look great, right? So, and I think a lot of cultures end up that same way, which is nobody sat down and kind of intentionally engineered this. They just ended up evolving in that direction. So the way that we think about culture, and this comes from our parent company, Click. We are a corporate spinout from Click Health. And so the co-founders of Sensei Labs had the chance to be among the senior leaders at Click Health, and we were able to help that company grow from really from the very beginning. Today, it's about 1,700 people. So it's a large enterprise today. And so we were able to be part of that growth curve and to help it to really think about culture as an evolution. I would say in an organization, you have culture when you have two people. So if you're not thinking about it at that point, it has already started to form and already starting to crystallize in a way that will be difficult to change later on, even at two people. If you're a solo founder and you hire your first employee, you now have culture. You can be intentional about the culture at that point, even though it probably feels like it's overbearing at that point and maybe unnecessary. But the really important thing to remember, especially in a smaller business as it's scaling, is the people you hire today are the people who are going to hire the next generation of team members. So at Sensei Labs, we call everybody senseis. Our senseis today, we're about 80 people, will be the ones who hire the next 100 senseis, and they will be the ones who hire the next 500 senseis. Mm-hmm. So if we don't be really intentional about culture today and making sure that every hire we make is transformative to the organization in some way, is representative of our sensei values, even if the way that those values get shown and displayed may evolve and change over time, but is aligned with our core sensei values. And I can talk more about that in a moment. But if we're not intentional about that now, then over time we drift further and further away from that North Star of where we want to be. In the world that we're now in, this becomes harder, as you just said, because we're not all necessarily sitting in the same office. And so that's a huge advantage as an employer for us to say, we are a Toronto-based company, so we used to hire primarily in the Toronto market. And now we're saying, well, we want to hire where the best talent is. It really doesn't matter where they are. And in fact, we have a global customer base across 5 continents. It's better for us to hire where our customers are than to necessarily hire here. So now as a company, we have senseis in Brazil, we have senseis in India, we have senseis in Western Canada, we have senseis in the US. So how do we continue to have that consistent culture as that grows? And the analogy that we come back to a lot on this topic is the idea of culture as a garden. So if you think of yourselves as the gardeners of the garden, it's your job to make sure that the garden has the right sunlight and nutrients and water, and that you weed out the parts that aren't good for the garden as it grows. But the garden is going to grow the way that it grows. So your job is to make sure that it has all the preconditions necessary to grow, and to understand that what the garden looks like today isn't necessarily what the garden is going to look like later, but you can influence the direction that that takes. And if you kind of take that a step further and you think about sometimes if you've been in a really formal, highly planned garden, it's kind of beautiful, but it doesn't really feel all that comfortable versus a garden that's been a bit more wild and has kind of grown on its own, right?
Yeah.
Where you feel that sense of being in nature and that sense of this is sort of grown on its own, that feels more comfortable than the highly structured planned one. And I think culture works the same way. It's the same as those offices that can be beautiful, but actually very impractical versus the ones where you think back to the startup in its kind of typical like brick and beam converted industrial space and it's kind of chaos and the desks are from IKEA and whatever, but the energy in there is so great. That's kind of where we want to end up from a culture perspective. And that's why the garden feels like such a great metaphor for your responsibility as a leader is to garden that garden.
Yeah, no, and we actually have seen a major shift. Prior to COVID, we saw many of our technology clients actually embrace the fact that the workplace needed to be a place that you want to be instead of have to be.
Right.
And we had never seen that shift before, but that was just with very high level tech from Google to Apple to Aurora, Aptiv, a lot of the autonomous car companies. But what was interesting is then COVID came and then other companies realized, oh my gosh, we might actually have to do the same thing.
Right.
And so now all of a sudden people are saying, how do we make this environment work better? And like you said, it's great to look at something pretty, but it doesn't necessarily function. So we had just in the last 2 years, we had one client, they have fireplaces all through their space. And it's probably the nicest space I've seen in about 5 years. We had another one make almost half a floor a gaming space, because they have mostly male engineers and software develop. And what they're doing is they want the games. They have from pool to high-end board games on the walls. They want a place where you can come and feel comfortable and stay, right? And then we had it's just all over board. We have another client that has a personal trainer come 3 days a week. They build out this huge gym with a full boxing area. And the trainer will work with employees. It's just amazing what employers have done. And this shift has been recent. Besides the tech companies, this is a new thing. And so I think it's really interesting that at least people are caring and they're asking their employees what they want. What do they want to have more comfortable in their space? And they are starting to design their space for those practical functions to get them to want to come to work.
Well, and also, frankly, and I imagine this is true for many of your listeners, they suddenly have way more space than they need. So now the question is, what do we do with all this space? Because we've already leased it. So we can't get back to the landlord. So, we took 10,000 square feet or 100,000 square feet. And now with the current occupancy of how often people want to be in the office, it turns out we probably needed half of that or a third of it. So we have all this extra space. What do we do with it? And so I think you are going to get some creative solutions where people do that. We actually were in a very fortunate position. We didn't have an office during COVID. We had sort of intentionally given ourselves the freedom of not having to worry about that. And so as we started to see that things were kind of clearing up and we were able to start to look at realistically, we could get everybody together. How do we want to think about that space? And we started actually, and this is an exercise we do quite often, let's go back to first principles. Why do we have an office? What purpose does having an office serve? Because I think even in the assumption of we should build a gym or we should build a gaming space or whatever it is, there is an assumption at the core of that says we need to find a way to get people back into the office. Why do you need to find a way to get people back into the office? If you look at productivity of companies over the last 2 years, for the most part, productivity hasn't actually dipped. In fact, in many ways, it's probably increased. And I would say maybe not in a totally positive way. I think there's a harder work-life balance for your team members when they're working from home. But if you had somebody that had a 2-hour commute to the office, and so now they're spending that portion of time working from home and not having to commute, even if you split the difference and they're spending half of that with their family and half on work, you're getting more out of them than you were getting before. And they're spending more uninterrupted time. Yes, there are downsides, absolutely. And it's important, and in fact, the responsibility of the gardeners to put some limitations in place that say it's really important that you do have some proper balance in your life. But if you go back to that first principle question, why is it important for people to be in the office? Some of that is just these long-held, what seem like fundamental truths that are not. They are just beliefs that we've invented. Why do we have a 5-day work week that's 9 to 5? It seems like it's always been that way. That's just the way that it should be. It's actually a creation of the Ford Motor Company.
Yeah.
Didn't exist prior to that, right? Why do we have hierarchical org charts that look the way they do? Well, that's the way it's always been, but it actually hasn't. It's the railroad companies that created org charts that look like that. If you go back and look up the very first org charts, it's actually a beautiful piece of design. You can find it in Google, but it actually just shows you the structure of the railroad. It goes from head office down the main lines to the branch lines, down to the rail to the individual station managers, gives you a very natural hierarchy for the org chart. That's why we have org charts today. So a lot of these truths that feel like fundamental things about what it means to run a company are actually just inventions that happened over the last 100 years. And so why do we feel that we're obligated to carry that forward? Why do almost every company in the world, why do they do an annual performance review when we all know that they don't do anything to advance performance? Everyone in the company hates the process. It's a giant waste of time and energy, but we do them because we've always done them. So why do we have offices? Is it because we've always had offices, or is it because they serve some really practical, important function? And so to come back to our story, we asked our team that question. And what came back strongly was, I miss connecting with people.
Mm-hmm.
I only want to do it 1 or 2 days a week. So we said, great. Instead of taking what probably at our size should have been 10,000 square feet based on the kind of standard heuristic measures of how much space you need and a little bit of space for future hiring and all that kind of stuff, we took 7,000 square feet, and that 7,000 square feet is going to serve us well for the next few years of growth. So already that was a departure from how most people would have looked at this. We took it as base building unrenovated space because it gave us the freedom to build something that didn't look like a traditional office.
Yep.
And we focused entirely on collaboration as the reason the space exists.
Yes.
There are no offices, there are no assigned seating or desks. Everyone has a locker, so you can keep stuff there if you want to use it while you're in the office, and you can put it back in your locker when you're not there. And we made sure that every aspect of this works just as well, whether you're a Toronto-based team member, sensei, or whether you're one of our more remote senseis who are flying into the office. You still get a locker. Everyone has exactly the same sort of space within the office. We have a bunch of bookable workstations, and we have large collaboration rooms and smaller team rooms. The larger collaboration rooms, there's a rotating schedule on every day of the week. We have 2 or 3 teams assigned into one of those collaboration rooms. And so if you're going to come in the office that week, come in on the day when your team is scheduled. That way you can organize your schedule around, let's spend that time together doing the kinds of things that are better done in person. We got giant whiteboards. We can do planning. We can do all that kind of stuff. Every room is completely set up for remote teams. There's cameras set up. There's TVs set up, all of that kind of stuff. So everybody can come in and collaborate, whether they're in person or whether they're joining virtually for that meeting. And the schedule rotates every week. So it adds a bit of complexity, but the advantage is if you come in on Monday in week 1, if you always came in on Monday, you're going to have the same other senseis in the office when you come in. But because the schedule rotates, it might be Monday on week 1, Thursday on week 2, and a completely different set of other teams in the office when you come in, which gives you the opportunity to see as many different people as possible. One of the things we've seen come up a lot in the complaints people have about the new hybrid workspace environment is, I just come in whenever I want, but I don't know who else is going to be in. So really what I'm doing is coming in to get on video calls all day that I could have taken from home. But there's no reason to do that. You're not gaining any advantage by having commuted to the office to spend the whole day on calls with people who aren't in the office. By putting a bit of structure around it, you're saying come in and spend that time on stuff that's better in person, and then spend the rest of your other 4 or 3 days a week, however often you want to come in, on the rest of it. We have some team members who love being in the office. It's a short commute for them. They book a workstation. I don't know that we have anyone who's coming in 5 days a week, but we probably have a bunch who are coming in 3 or 4 days a week. And then we have some who have never come in, and that's totally fine as well. And then really the bulk of our team comes in 1 or 2 days a week.
No, that's amazing. I thank you for sharing that story. I like how you've set it up, and I love the collaboration areas. We're seeing that across the board too, as companies start to right size and redesign their space. The other unique function we've seen is what we call flight to quality, and what that is exactly what you said. Instead of 10,000 square feet, you need 7, and you go to a building that actually already has a lot of amenities, so you don't have to build them, and you actually go up in class to a nicer building. So you take less square footage in a nicer building, hence you end up paying around the same price because you're in a better building with more amenities and you're not paying for the same amount of square footage. So we're seeing that with a lot of small to mid-sized companies as well, which is really interesting. What are your thoughts on technology? Obviously, there's been I think a lot of significant changes, a lot of adoption that had never occurred before.
Yeah, I think technology is shifting in some interesting ways. We're seeing the emergence of a bunch of new sort of categories of tools that didn't exist before, or at least we have some where we have maybe I'll pick on something like virtual whiteboards. So like Miro is a great tool. It is definitely not a replacement to a real whiteboard with a group of people in a room all together. That's a very hard thing to replace. But I would say if you're going to a virtual whiteboard, it's as good as you're going to get. It's a really great tool. We use it for collaboration. And it does have the advantage that everyone can easily see it, even if they're not, if they're joining the call over Teams or they're in person or whatever. So some advantages there. But the rate of innovation we've seen in that category or similar categories has been pretty amazing over the last 2 years, because before that, everybody kind of looked at it like, well, I mean, I guess if I have to, I'll use this. But like, really, we're just going to get everybody together in a room. And then we couldn't get everyone together in a room. And so the rate of the innovation in the kind of virtual collaboration, meeting online sort of space has been pretty amazing. There's some companies that have pushed this really far out, like Spatial, if you've ever come across them. And so that's where you're starting to get into the virtual reality meeting space. I just don't think it's caught on yet.
No.
And I'm not sure that it will. I'm a little pessimistic on that. We'll see. I think that so far, the experience is not enough better than a Teams call or a Zoom call that I'm going to sit with my headset on and be in a virtual reality space. There's maybe some advantages, and we'll see where it gets to, but so far that hasn't, I think, demonstrated itself enough. But when we look at platforms like our own, so Conductor is an interesting question here in this, or an interesting case in this question, because the rate of the adaptation of technology across the board in enterprise has gone up significantly. And so where we would have seen in the past, maybe teams who said, look, we're running this massive transformation, but we're just going to use Excel and PowerPoint. It's fine. When we get to today, we're seeing if you're a large professional service firm, so one of our biggest partners is Kearney, the management consulting company. Kearney uses Conductor as their delivery platform when they're doing large engagements around the world. They have gone from, we would like to use technology to deliver this, and their clients saying, why? To, we can't bid on this work unless we are bringing a technology platform into the bid with us. It's now a criteria for the RFP.
Yep. I love it. I think that's great. Now, tell me about the book, The Decoding Company, and how it could possibly help teams evolve faster.
Yeah, so Decoding Company is really where all of this thinking kind of started for us. So Click is a really interesting case. Click has consistently grown 30 to 40% year over year for the last 25 years. It's its 25th anniversary this year. And so that kind of hyper growth has all kinds of its own set of challenges from a leadership perspective, from a culture perspective, from a team building perspective. And Click has done a very good job of navigating all of that. And so we were constantly getting asked the question, how do you manage to sustain that kind of rate of growth? And the mathematical part of it is that it's easy to grow at that rate when you're a small company. But as the scale gets bigger, the numerator and denominator have to grow in a different kind of way, right? So like 30% growth at your first million in revenue isn't that hard, but 30% growth at 100 million in revenue is a completely different equation. And so how do you continue that sort of scale? In the professional service business, Click is a commercialization partner for life science and biotech companies. So helping them to bring life-saving therapies to market in oncology and multiple sclerosis and conditions like that. And really by sort of set of service delivery, Click looks a lot like a marketing agency. So when you're in the professional service space, that kind of growth is tied directly to headcount, because what you're really selling are hours of people's time. So if you're going to add 30% of revenue, you have to have 30% more hours to sell, which pretty much means you have to grow headcount in parallel to revenue growth. And so how do you continue to hire at a very high caliber of talent, and ideally an increasing caliber of talent as you're scaling the team? and keep up with that kind of growth. So we would get that question a lot, and we'd sort of figured out how to answer the question. A lot of it had to do with technology enablement in platforms we had built for ourselves inside of Click in a tool that we call Genome. And we had this sort of hypothesis that we should write a book about the experience of having built these tools and how we use talent, how we use data and how we use technology to create a talent-centric workplace. And so we started to kind of work through this idea of a book, and we were very happy to get published by Penguin. And so we started working with them on the book, and this whole thing kind of came together. We put it out. It came out in February 2014, and we got super, super lucky with the timing of the book, because we really wrote about two big trends. We talked about big data and how you can use especially ambient big data in an organization to understand what engages and drives the people in the organization and how to create a better workplace for them. And then we talked about culture and talent-centric workplaces and sort of the intersection of these two things. At the exact moment where both of those became kind of top of the headline trends that people were super interested in. And so as a result, the book way exceeded our best expectation, which was hopefully people will read this and want to come and work for us. And it became a New York Times bestseller. And that gave us this incredible opportunity to travel all over the world. And everywhere that we gave talks, whether it was at places like Harvard Business School or at NASA or Twitter's headquarters, Google had us out to a whole bunch of their campuses, TED, wherever it was, there was always a lineup of people when we came off stage who wanted to know where they could buy the software. They were also running hypergrowth companies. Nothing on the market met their need. How can we get our hands on the tools that you've built for yourself? And that's really what led us directly to Sensei Labs and the creation of Conductor as a platform. How do we enable those other companies to use the tools that we had built for ourselves? Commercializing a platform that you built internally is a very difficult journey for anyone who has done this before, who's listening. I'm sure that they are agreeing. It's not a task for the faint of heart, but it is certainly doable when you've got that good idea and you've got some willing early customers who understand that they're kind of early beta testers. For us, that was a US company called UWM, United Wholesale Mortgage. Today, UWM is the second largest lender in the US. About 10,000 people now. They were about 1,200 when we started working with them. And they're just about to go into, I think it's year 7 or year 8 of using our platform, which has been an amazing journey that we've got to be on together. So thank you to Matt Ishbia, the CEO of UWM, and for believing in us at that beginning and wanting to be that early beta customer that helped us to take all these ideas from Decoded and bring them to life through Conductor.
Oh, that's amazing. So what do you think the future of work looks like?
I think it's an interesting question because it will change less than we think it will until all of a sudden it doesn't look anything like it does today. I think there's a famous quote about going broke. It happened very slowly and then all of a sudden at once, right? It's the same kind of thing when you look at change over a long period of time. What will the future of work look like in 6 months from now? It's not really going to look all that different than it does today. That pendulum about hybrid is going to swing back and forth, and eventually it's going to settle somewhere. We think that it's a huge competitive advantage for us as an employer to offer this to people. It's what they're asking for. And so we kind of really hope that all of the other companies in the same talent markets we're in insist on bringing people back to the office because the people don't really want to come back. And so they are leaving companies like that, looking for companies that have hybrid workplaces. We're happy to hire them, if they fit the jobs that we're hiring into. And so I think short term, it doesn't look all that different. But what does it look like in a few years from now? There's some broad trend lines you can draw. Technology will continue to be more and more important. We believe that familiarity with data and an understanding of how to use it in decision making will become more and more critical. And so in Decoded, we talk really about 3 large trends. We talk about the 3 Decoded principles. Technology as a coach is the first of them. And the idea here is that if you look at sort of any big human achievement, so look at top athletes, look at top musicians and performers, look at top CEOs and business leaders, and they almost always have a coach that they work with. And so those top athletes obviously have a coach on the team. The top CEOs will have advisors and mentors and coaches who they work with. And so how do you take the idea of that but make it scalable to anybody in an organization. It's just not scalable to do it using people, but it is scalable to do it using technology. And so as technology gets smarter and better, and certainly AI and ML play into this to some degree, but as that technology gets better, then we start to be able to apply it as a coach that can help everybody to achieve more in their own pursuits in the organization. So that's part of this trend line, is technology goes from being a tool that we use to a coach that's helping us to achieve more. The second is data as a sixth sense, which is the idea that really we are at our best when we augment our human instincts with analytics and data to help us make better decisions faster. And so that's part of the goal that we want to get to. And platforms like Conductor are a huge help here, but how do you get the right data to the right person at the right moment so that they can make a better decision? And that's a big part of that trend line. Again, related in some ways to AI and ML, but not necessarily relying on it, just smarter tools that have a better understanding of context. And then the third is engineered ecosystems. And it's back to that idea really that you have culture at two people, or that you can be very intentional about the design of your workplace, not just in the physical environment, but in the culture, in the tools, in the values, in the beliefs. And so if I look at Sensei Labs, we have defined our culture by what we call our 6 Sensei values. They spell the word Sensei, so it's very, very easy to remember. And so all of our Senseis are well sort of into the belief around the importance of those values in everything we do. The values are being selfless, being empathetic, being nimble, being skilled, being entrepreneurial, and having integrity. That is our Sensei values. And so we have engineered an environment where those values are just part of the fabric of being at Sensei. There is a structure to our interviews when we're hiring that is built around those values and the kinds of questions that we ask. There's a structure around every one of our roles in the organization. There's actually a giant spreadsheet that everyone has access to. And for every role, you can look at every value and see what the expected observable behaviors are, and you can plot your career path out on that. For promotion decisions, they're tied back to those values. Our recognition system is structured on it. That's a kind of extreme example of engineered ecosystems, but I think it plays into the future of work question, because the companies that take that seriously and invest the effort into it are, and you can see this in real data about performance, the ones that win more. Mm-hmm. So that becomes an important part of this. That intentionality of how we've engineered our ecosystem is a critical part of what makes us successful as an organization.
Well, I'm looking outside and it's this beautiful day, spring, and we have a little bit of a garden out here, and it's making me think through what you said earlier. So thank you for that. Our goal with Evolve is to help leaders to learn, connect, and grow together. And Jay, you have done that. And thank you so much for spending your time with us today. And I can't wait to share this with the world.
Thank you, Kim. It was a pleasure.